Mr. Speaker,
Order.
Item 2, resumption of debate on the original motion and the amendments to the original motion, standing in the names of Mr. Louis Ng and Mr. Dennis Tan, respectively.
Mr. Louis Chua.
Mr. Speaker, the motion first raised by Member Louis Ng to accelerate and deepen efforts against climate change is an urgent one, as we make a decision on how we want to rebuild our economy and what kind of an economy we envisage for Singapore in future. Just recently at the Climate Ambition Summit 2020, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres urged all governments to declare a state of climate emergency. Our government has also acknowledged the threat of climate change and put in place a number of strategies to tackle this global issue. But are we doing enough as a nation? Are we acknowledging the climate emergency for what it is? In March 2020, Singapore submitted an updated nationally determined contribution to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. While we previously committed to reduce our emissions intensity levels on a per dollar of GDP basis, the new NDC adopts an absolute emissions target instead. This is a step forward as it provides greater transparency and reinforces the government's commitment to tackling climate change. However, when we take a closer look at the updated target, how much has actually changed? The first NDC, submitted in 2015, stated our intention to reduce emissions intensity by 36% from 2005 levels by 2030. And this would imply emissions at around 65 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, with the aim of peaking around 2030. Similarly, the updated NDC reiterates that Singapore intends to peak emissions at 65 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emission around 2030, and only reach net zero emissions as soon as viable in the second half of the century. While we now have an absolute emissions target, this absolute figure of 65 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent is actually equivalent to the 36% reduction in emissions intensity from 2005 levels by 2030. And hence, it is the same target that was set back in 2015. To put it bluntly, the updated target does not genuinely limit emissions growth today beyond what was already committed to under our first NDC. Now, I recognize that the government is targeting 33 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions by 2050, which is half that of the 65 million tonnes around 2030. And as a nation, Singapore's climate targets still fall short of IPCC's recommendations to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. In contrast, the European Union, Japan, Republic of Korea have pledged carbon neutrality by 2050, along with more than 110 other countries. Even China, the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide, is pledging to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. Even as a small island state, Singapore has always been daring in our vision for the future. Climate change should be no different. We can, should, and must do more. In view of these, I would like to propose 4 specific areas for improvement to reflect our nation's commitment to tackling climate change. Firstly, we need to set more ambitious targets in growing our renewable energy mix. According to statistics from the Singapore's Energy Market Authority, as at July 2020, 96% of our electricity in Singapore is produced from natural gas, 1.2% from coal and petroleum products, and 2.8% is from other sources, including solar. I recognize that there are significant challenges to deploying solar on a large scale in Singapore, including land constraints and local weather conditions. Yet, we were still able to punctually achieve our 2020 solar deployment target of 350 megawatt peak in the first quarter of 2020, reaching 1.5 gigawatt peak by 2025, and at least 2 gigawatt peak by 2030. Solar, however, is only expected to contribute 3% of our electricity needs. Are we genuinely pushing the boundaries or simply setting benchmarks we can easily hit? Earlier in January this year, I asked the Minister for Trade and Industry on whether we have a target mix for the amount of electricity generated from renewable energy sources in 2030 and 2050, and if we will consider setting a target mix that we can strive for together as a nation. However, I do not recall such a target being shared. The Workers' Party previously called for a minimum of 10% of Singapore's energy to come from renewable sources by 2025, and the IEA also estimates that 30% of electricity generation globally in 2020 is already from renewable sources. A starting point for us then is having a target in the first place. Secondly, the carbon tax is another area with much potential for impact. To put simply, the IMF has described carbon pricing as the single most powerful way to combat climate change. It is commendable that Singapore implemented a carbon tax in 2019, the first nation in Southeast Asia to do so. But the current rate of $5 per tonne, however, is too nominal, sitting far below global scientific recommendations. I fully recognize that this is a sensitive period to be raising the carbon tax, and also note the government's plan to review the tax rate by 2023 and increase it to between $10 and $15 by 2030. As member Louis Ng said earlier in his speech, this is far too low. I urge the government to adopt a carbon price trajectory that is better aligned with the latest research on what is effective. This should also be complemented by financial assistance schemes to help cushion the impact of the carbon tax for lower-income households. Thirdly, Singapore's refining and petrochemicals sector remains an elephant in the room in our discussions on climate change. In 2017, about 75% of our industrial emissions were from this sector. There is therefore an urgent need to consider the role of such industries will play in the Singapore economy of 2050 and beyond. Already, we are starting to see key players restructure and pivot towards cleaner energy sources, particularly in the wake of COVID-19's impact on energy demand and prices. Both Shell and BP have set ambitious targets of becoming a net zero emissions company by 2050. Shell is investing in more lower carbon technology while expanding its renewable energy and power division. Thus far, the government has been advocating for a practical approach, a realistic approach towards the petrochemical industry, given that it is a key employer and a key contributor to our economy today. However, we are already seeing signs of the practical changes oil majors are making today in preparing for the company's realistic future. In June 2020, BP announced it is cutting 10,000 jobs or 15% of its workforce. In October 2020, ExxonMobil announced it is cutting 14,000 jobs globally, 15% of its workforce. Closer to home, Shell is targeting to cut 500 jobs by 2023 at Pulau Bukom from the current 1,300 staff today, and with refining capacity halved in the next 1 to 2 years. Given Singapore's position as a leading oil and gas hub in Asia, it is inevitable that such changes will impact our economy. Yet should our focus still remain on the old economy industries of the past? With oil majors pivoting away from fossil fuels, shouldn't Singapore proactively engage these companies to partner them on their journey to a net zero future? How can we accelerate the restructuring of our economy to be better prepared for a low-carbon future, which is fast approaching? This brings me to my fourth and final point on Singapore's potential to successfully drive the green revolution if we genuinely commit to accelerating our efforts on this front. This is not the first time we are breaking new ground for Singapore. Shell built an oil refinery on Pulau Bukom in 1961, and it was the first foreign investor to receive Singapore's Pioneer Certificate No. 1 for its investment. A small island to the south of Singapore became one of the largest refining complexes globally and sparked the start of Singapore's pursuit of the petrochemicals industry. While the sun is setting for fossil fuels, the time has come for a new period of rapid development in the clean energy industry. Minister Masagos previously said in 2018 that the clean energy industry will add as many as 2.2 million jobs in Southeast Asia by 2030. Looking at global trends, this number will only continue to grow. To keep pace, We must continue to upsize the green industry and ensure our workforce is prepared to take on these new roles. I highly commend the recent move to boost training and recruitment of local talents in the solar industries and urge the relevant agencies to expand and extend this commitment to other green industries as well. Mr. Speaker, in Mandarin, please. 议长先生，即使身为一个罪额小国，新加坡一直敢于规划我们对未来的愿景。处理气候变化问题也应该持有相同的态度。联合国秘书长古特雷斯在巴黎协定签署5周年之际所举办的2020年气候雄心峰会时致辞时，促请世界各国领袖宣布国家进入气候紧急状态，直到各国实现碳中和为止。我们不单需要认知气候紧急状态的存在，我们可以、应该，并且必须做更多工作，以抑制气候变化所带来的影响。有鉴于此，我想提出4个需要改进的环节，以反映新加坡对应对气候变化许下的承诺。首先，我们需要为扩大可再生能源组合制定更宏伟的目标。工人党曾呼吁，截止2025年，至少10%的新加坡能源应该来自可再生能源。其次，碳税是另一个具有影响和潜力的政策工具。我希望政府结合多方面的研究，更好地制定有效的碳税目标水平。这也应该与财政援助计划相辅相成，以帮助减轻低收入家庭受到碳税的影响。提及新加坡对气候变化的具体应对措施，一定触及到炼油和石化行业。但是面对这棘手的问题，我们还未正面回应。在2017年，我们约75%的工业排放都来自这些行业，因此，我们迫切需要考虑这些行业在2050年甚至2050年之后所扮演的经济角色。我们如何加快经济结构调整，为即将到来的低碳未来做好更完善的准备呢？为了跟上时代的步伐，我们必须继续提升绿色产业的规模，并确保我们的劳动市场已做好准备，接受这个新的角色。议长先生，新加坡应对气候变化仍有很大的改进空间。第一步就是认知气候变化目前的紧急状态。与其将这些变化视为经济增长和进步的绊脚石，更应该被视为对未来发展的投资。从长远来看，建设零碳经济有助于提升经济增长，这点已经日益得到世界各国政府和公司的认可。例如，淡马锡控股也承诺在2050年实现净碳排放的目标。作为一个国家，让我们持续挑战自己，进一步拓展边界，为我们的下一代制定更高的目标，并以勇敢、坚韧不畏惧的精神应对气候变化的威胁。Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, Singapore still has much room for improvement in our efforts to tackle climate change. And the very first step is to recognize the climate emergency for what it is today. Yet the beauty of it is that these changes need not come at the expense of economic growth and progress, but should instead be viewed as an investment into the industries of the future. The UK's Climate Change Committee has concluded that despite there being an overall cost in bringing about the technologies to reduce carbon emissions, there is an increase in economic prosperity in terms of an aggregate increase in GDP, jobs, and real disposable incomes. Building a zero-carbon economy is a critical pathway to more resilient economic growth in the long run, a fact that is increasingly recognized by governments and corporations around the world. Even Temasek, for instance, has committed to delivering a net zero emissions portfolio by 2050. As a nation, let's challenge ourselves to push the boundaries further, to not be afraid to set the bar higher for the sake of our children, and to be more courageous in our collective fight against the existential threat of climate change. Thank you.
Ms. Graceful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to ask Member Mr. Louis Chua for two supplementary questions. First of all, it's on carbon tax. I appreciate his point about the current tax level being low and we should raise it further. I'd just like to know if he has specific targets or specific carbon tax that he thinks Workers' Party would like to propose. Number two, he has drawn comparison with Japan, Korea, and China, who have announced carbon neutral targets. I would like to again seek Mr. Louis Chua's explanation if there are any specific proposals or actions that these countries would adopt in order to reach these goals that Singapore have not considered.
I thank the Minister for her supplementary questions. I think the first on the carbon tax, I think as mentioned by Member Louis Ng as well, the current carbon tax levels is far too low, and I wouldn't want to preempt my colleague who will be speaking on this further. But I would say that at this point in time, if you look at the government's plan to review the tax rate by 2023, I think the $10 to $15 levels, I think that is a level which we believe, and I believe Member Louis Ng has also agreed that is inadequate. I will leave it to my colleague, James, who will be speaking a bit further on what we do propose to be the levels of the carbon tax. I think on the second question, in terms of the what some of these other developed countries have done that we haven't already, no, I think this is a continuum. This is a continued progress. I think to me the very first step is, as I mentioned in my speech, that we have to set ourselves a bold target. I mean, if you just look at the example of the energy mix, for example, I think that is one starting point which we could consider to basically reduce our reliance on basically fossil fuel sources for energy. I think that's one way where we can start to basically set the target for what is the level of energy generation from renewable sources that we'd like to consider. And I think this is something which I think we have to start with the end goal in mind in terms of potentially reaching net zero much earlier rather than later.
Minister Graceful.
Thank you for the clarification. The reason for me to ask the clarification is the first place is in order to understand if that proposal to be like Japan, Korea, and China have been formed with the national context, our local Singapore context in mind. Because like all countries, we have our own constraints, we have our own opportunities to move towards renewable energy. So it's important that when we set policies and we advocate targets here, even as we want to be ambitious, even if we want to be pathfinding, it's important to have that understanding and that realization behind. So that's the purpose of my clarification. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Louis Chua, do you want to respond? You don't have to.
Thank you, Minister, for the response. So indeed, and so again, if you just use the our energy sources, I do recognize that we have geographical constraints, and even in the use of solar, for example, we have set a target to reach 2 gigawatt peaks by 2030. But I think is there more that we could do to basically bring this number higher? And so I think in the last session in January, I think some of the members have also asked about this question. And I also understand that certain projects are basically in the pipeline in terms of potentially importing solar energy from our neighbors or even from Australia in terms of the project that is ongoing there. So I believe there are various technological pathways which we can achieve some of these targets. But I think this is where I think that, in the first place, I think for us to be able to recognize this climate emergency and to basically set ourselves a bit more of an ambitious target, given that Singapore has always had this history of outperforming its original expectations.